It started for me not with a ghost story or a local legend, but with a badly photocopied list of rules shoved into my hands by the day manager, a tired-looking man named Bill who smelled like stale coffee and seemed in a hurry to leave. He didn't make eye contact when he gave it to me, just pointed a stubby finger at the single page and told me to memorize it, that my job depended on it. The grand old Starline Hotel in the middle of nowhere, Texas, wasn't so grand anymore, just a 3-story relic off a forgotten highway, its neon sign flickering a weak invitation to the occasional lost traveler or trucker who'd missed his turn. The pay was decent, enough to keep me in rent and cheap beer, and the solitude of the night shift suited my temperament. I figured the rules were just some corporate nonsense about customer service or not stealing the towels. I was wrong. The list was short, typed in a faint, almost faded font, and it made no sense at all. Rule number 1. Between the hours of 2:04 a.m. and 2:16 a.m. exactly, you must not look at the security monitor that shows the corridor of the 3rd floor. If you do, you must immediately look away and count backwards from 100, not aloud, but in your mind. Rule number 2. If a guest calls down to the front desk and complains that their room is too cold, you are to apologize and tell them the central heating is out for the night. Do not, under any circumstances, send maintenance. Rule number 3. Should you hear the sound of a party, specifically big band music and laughter, coming from the grand ballroom, you are to ignore it. Do not investigate. If the music stops abruptly and is followed by a single, clear note from a trumpet, lock the front desk door and hide behind the counter until you hear the clock in the lobby chime 4 times. Rule number 4. The vending machine in the basement will sometimes eat your money. If it gives you 2 items instead of 1, leave the extra item on the floor in front of the machine. Do not take it. Rule number 5. The man in the gray suit who sometimes sits in the lobby armchair is not a guest. Do not acknowledge him. If he stands up, pretend to be engrossed in a task until he leaves. Rule number 6. This is the most important one, it said. At exactly 3:33 a.m., you must go to the lobby restroom and run the hot water in the left-hand sink for exactly 1 minute. You must not look in the mirror during this time. The first week was quiet, unnervingly so. The old building creaked and settled like any other, and the only guests were a tired-looking salesman and a couple who argued quietly at check-in. I mostly read books and watched the staticky security feed, the list of rules tucked under my keyboard like a dirty secret. I thought it was a joke, a hazing ritual for the new night guy. That changed on my 8th night. It was a slow Tuesday, rain pattering against the large lobby windows, turning the world outside into a blur of dark shapes and streaked light. I was dozing off, my head dipping towards the cool wood of the desk, when the phone rang, jolting me awake. The voice on the other end was thin, strained, a man's voice. He said he was in room 307, and that his room was freezing, that he could see his own breath. A cold knot tightened in my stomach. Rule number 2. I apologized, my voice sounding foreign to me, and recited the line about the central heating. The man started to protest, his voice cracking, saying it felt like the cold was coming from inside the room, from the walls themselves. Then the line went dead with a soft click, not a dial tone, but a silence that felt heavy and final. I sat there, the receiver pressed to my ear for a long moment, my heart hammering against my ribs. I fought the urge to call the room back, to send someone up there. Instead, I just sat, staring at the rain-streaked glass, feeling like I had just failed some unspoken test. Nothing happened for the rest of the night, but the air in the lobby felt thicker, colder. The next incident was with the vending machine. I'd gone down to the basement to get a soda, the fluorescent lights humming overhead, casting a sickly glow on the concrete floor and the old, dusty furniture stored down there. I slid my dollars into the machine, pressed the button for a cola. With a loud clunk, 2 cans slid into the tray. 1 cola and 1 root beer. I stared at them, the memory of Rule 4 echoing in my head. Leave the extra item on the floor. It seemed so wasteful, so stupid. I stood there for a full minute, arguing with myself. It was just a soda. What was the harm? Finally, with a sigh of frustration, I picked up both cans and turned to leave. As I did, the lights in the basement flickered. Not a power dip, but a rapid, frantic strobing. In the bursts of light and darkness, I saw something move near the far wall, a tall, shadowy figure that seemed to be standing where there had been nothing before. A jolt of pure, undiluted fear shot through me. I dropped the cans, both of them, and scrambled for the stairs, not looking back. I didn't stop until I was behind the relative safety of the front desk, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I never went back to the basement for a snack again. After that, I started taking the rules seriously. I became a creature of ritual, my nights governed by the strange, arbitrary laws of the Starline Hotel. At 2:04 a.m., I would deliberately turn the security monitor away, facing the wall, and I would count backwards in my head, the numbers a silent mantra against the creeping dread. At 3:33 a.m., I would go to the lobby restroom, my eyes fixed on the tiled floor, and run the hot water, the steam fogging the mirror I refused to look into. It was during one of these water running sessions that I first saw the man in the gray suit. I was walking out of the restroom, my head down, when I caught a glimpse of him from the corner of my eye. He was sitting in the high-backed armchair in the far corner of the lobby, perfectly still. He was tall and gaunt, his suit an old-fashioned cut, and his face was pale and oddly smooth, like polished stone. I remembered Rule 5 immediately. I forced myself to keep walking, to not even glance in his direction. I sat down at the desk and pretended to be utterly fascinated by the guest ledger, my pen shaking in my hand. I could feel his presence, a cold spot in the room, a weight on the air. I didn't look up for what felt like an hour, and when I finally risked a glance, the chair was empty. The worst of it, the thing that truly convinced me the hotel was not just haunted, but actively malevolent, was the ballroom. It happened around 1 a.m. on a night when the hotel was completely empty, a rare occurrence that should have been peaceful. I was reading when I heard it, faint at first, then growing clearer. It was music, the kind my grandfather used to listen to, a swinging big band tune. Laughter and the clinking of glasses layered over it, the sounds of a lively party. It was coming from down the hall, from the sealed-off grand ballroom. Rule 3. I tried to ignore it, to focus on my book, but the music was so cheerful, so out of place in the silent, dusty hotel. It was a siren song. Against every instinct screaming at me to stay put, I stood up. The rational part of my brain, the part that was quickly shrinking, told me it was a radio left on by a cleaner or a trick of the old plumbing. I had to know. I walked slowly down the corridor towards the large, ornate double doors of the ballroom. The music grew louder, the laughter more distinct. I could almost smell perfume and cigar smoke. I reached the doors and pressed my ear against the cool, polished wood. The party was in full swing on the other side. I could hear a woman's bright laugh, the shuffle of feet on a dance floor. It sounded so real, so alive. Then, as suddenly as if a plug had been pulled, it stopped. The music, the laughter, the chatter, all of it vanished into a silence that was somehow louder than the noise had been. And then, cutting through the quiet, a single, pure, mournful note from a trumpet. My blood ran cold. Rule 3. I turned and ran, not back to the front desk, but to the small janitor's closet I knew had a lock. I scrambled inside, fumbling in the dark, and slammed the bolt home just as I heard the distinct, heavy sound of the ballroom doors swinging open down the hall. I crouched there in the dark, surrounded by the smell of bleach and old mops, my heart pounding so hard I thought it would burst. I didn't hear footsteps, but I felt a presence moving down the hallway, a wave of intense cold that seeped under the door. I held my breath, praying it would pass. I stayed in that closet, trembling, until I heard the old grandfather clock in the lobby solemnly chime 4 times. Only then did I dare to creep out. The hallway was empty. The ballroom doors were closed. Everything was as it had been, save for the lingering chill in the air. From that night on, I was a true believer. The rules were my Bible, my shield. I followed them with a religious fervor. I saw the man in the gray suit several more times, always in that same chair, and I never, ever acknowledged him. I ran the water every night at 3:33, my eyes glued to the drain. The monotony of the terror became its own kind of routine. I stopped questioning why, I just obeyed. That changed about 6 months in. A new guest arrived, a young guy maybe a few years older than me, loud and confident, here for some kind of sales conference that was happening in the next town over. He checked in late, smelling of beer and cologne, and gave me a cocky grin when I handed him his key. He was in room 303 on the 3rd floor. I didn't think much of it until later that night, when the clock ticked past 2 a.m. I had just turned the security monitor for the 3rd floor corridor towards the wall when the phone rang. It was him, his voice slurred with sleep or drink. He said his tea wasn't working, that it was just showing static. I told him I'd have maintenance look at it in the morning. He grumbled and hung up. A few minutes later, at 2:07 a.m., the phone rang again. It was him again, but his voice was different now, sharp and clear, all traces of drunkenness gone. He said, "Hey, man, there's someone outside my door." A cold dread washed over me. I told him it was probably just another guest. "No," he whispered, his voice tight with fear. "They're not moving. They're just standing there. I can see their shadow under the door." My eyes flicked involuntarily to the security monitor I had turned to the wall. Rule 1. "Don't look, sir," I said, my voice trembling. "I need you to stay in your room. Do not open the door. I can hear them breathing," he said, his voice cracking into a sob. "It's a weird sound, like something's broken inside." Then I heard it, a faint, wet, rasping sound transmitted through the phone line. It was the most horrible sound I had ever heard. "Help me," the man pleaded. I was frozen. The rules were clear. Do not look. Do not get involved. But this was a real person, a living, breathing man who was terrified. I heard a soft, scraping sound from his end of the line, like something dragging slowly along the wood of his door. The man let out a small, choked cry. I couldn't just sit there. The phone felt like a block of ice in my hand, the man's terrified whispers freezing the very air in my lungs. It was one thing to follow the rules when they were about phantom chills or ghostly music, abstract concepts that threatened only a general sense of dread. This was different. This was a voice, a real human voice, cracking with a fear so raw and immediate it felt like a physical thing in the room with me. The list of rules was tucked under my keyboard, a silent, tyrannical spectator. I imagined the words on the page glowing with a malevolent light, demanding obedience. But another part of me, the part that remembered what it was like to be human, to feel empathy, screamed that this was wrong. This wasn't a test of my ability to follow orders. It was a test of my soul. The man in room 303 was going to die, and I was going to be an accomplice to his murder by inaction. Murdered by the very shadows I was paid to ignore. My hand trembled as I reached for the monitor. It was an old, heavy thing with a thick glass screen that reflected the dim glow of the desk lamp, showing me my own pale, wide-eyed face. My fingers brushed against the cold plastic bezel. It felt like touching a tomb. Every instinct, every fiber of my being that had been conditioned by the last few months, shrieked at me to stop, to turn away, to start the mental countdown that was my only shield. But then I heard him again, a wet, choked sob. "Please," he begged, the word barely audible. That single word broke me. I tightened my grip, and with a slow, deliberate effort that took every ounce of my strength, I turned the monitor back towards me. The screen fizzed with static for a heartbeat before resolving into the familiar, grainy black and white image of the third-floor hallway. The perspective was from the end of the hall, near the fire exit, looking down the long, carpeted stretch towards the elevators. The yellowing sconces on the walls cast more shadow than light, creating pools of deep gloom between each door. At first, it looked empty. Just the same silent, deserted corridor I had seen 1,000 times. A part of me, a foolish, hopeful part, felt a surge of relief. Maybe it was his imagination, a drunken nightmare. Maybe the rules were just paranoid nonsense after all. And then my eyes, adjusting to the poor resolution, found room 303. The door was closed, but there, on the floor, directly in front of it, was the shadow. It was all wrong. The other shadows in the hall were soft, blurred at the edges, cast by the dim lights. This one was different. It was a slice of absolute nothingness, a black so deep and complete it seemed to suck the light from the screen around it. It was man-shaped, but its proportions were a grotesque parody of a human form. It was too tall, its head nearly brushing the ceiling in the camera's perspective, and impossibly thin, like a stretched silhouette. It didn't lie flat on the carpet. It had a faint, unsettling dimensionality to it, as if it were a standing column of solid darkness. It was utterly motionless. The stillness was more terrifying than any movement could have been. It was the stillness of a predator that knows its prey is cornered. I stared, my breath caught in my throat, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs. I was frozen, trapped by the horrific impossibility of what I was seeing. Then it moved. The movement was slow, fluid, and utterly silent. The long, thin arm, a limb of pure void, began to rise from its side. It wasn't an arm that bent at an elbow. It was more like a tendril of smoke solidifying into a terrible purpose. It uncurled, extending towards the camera. The hand, if it could be called that, was just longer, thinner shadows, tapering into points. And then one of those points, the index finger, extended. It didn't point at the door of room 303. It didn't point at anything in its immediate vicinity. It pointed straight down the length of the hall, straight down the lens of the security camera. It pointed directly at me. A visceral, physical reaction slammed into me. A wave of nausea so intense I tasted bile at the back of my throat. A dizzying vertigo made the lobby swim around me, the floor seeming to tilt. I felt a coldness that had nothing to do with the air conditioning, a deep, penetrating chill that started in my bones and spread outwards. It saw me. The thing in the hallway, the shadow, knew I was watching. It was acknowledging me. I wrenched my eyes away from the screen, squeezing them shut so tightly I saw bursts of color against my eyelids. The afterimage of that pointing finger was burned into my vision, a black scar on my sight. The rule. I had to follow the rule now. It was my only hope. 100, I began in my mind, the number feeling stupid and insignificant. 99, 98, the phone was still pressed to my ear. The man's breathing was ragged, hysterical. It's whispering my name, he sobbed, his voice a broken thing. How does it know my name? It's saying it over and over. 97, 96, his name. I realized with a fresh jolt of horror that I knew his name. It was right there on the check-in ledger. Mark Davis. Was the shadow whispering Mark? Was it using the name he had signed with a cocky flourish just hours ago? The thought was unbearable. 95, 94. I heard a new sound, faint through the phone, but crystal clear in the utter silence of the lobby. It was a soft, metallic rattling. The sound of a door handle being jiggled, slowly, deliberately. Not someone trying to get in, but something testing the lock. Mark let out a sharp, terrified gasp. "It's at the door," he whimpered, his voice dropping to a whisper. as if he were afraid the thing outside could hear him through the wood. 93, 92, 91. The rattling stopped. The silence that followed was somehow worse. It was a listening silence. I could picture the shadow, its fingers still pointed at me down the camera, its head cocked, listening for the sounds of fear from inside the room. I kept counting, the numbers a desperate, silent prayer. 90, 89. Then came the sound I knew would haunt me for the rest of my life. It wasn't a loud bang, not at first. It was a low, groaning, splintering crack, the sound of old wood surrendering to an immense, unnatural pressure. It was the sound of the doorframe around room 303 giving way. Mark Davis screamed. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated terror. A raw, animalistic shriek that tore through the phone line and seemed to fill the entire lobby. It was the sound of a man seeing death itself, in its most horrifying form, coming for him. The scream was cut off not by the sound of the door bursting open, but by a sudden, wet, choking sound. It was a brief, gurgling noise, like a man trying to scream with a mouth full of mud. And then there was nothing. Absolute, dead silence on the other end of the line. The phone line didn't go to a dial tone. It just went quiet, a hollow, empty silence that was more final than any busy signal could ever be. I kept counting. Tears were streaming down my face now, hot and shameful. I couldn't stop them. My entire body was shaking uncontrollably, my muscles twitching with adrenaline and terror. I was counting through clenched teeth, my jaw so tight it ached. 88, 87, 86. I counted all the way down to 1, my mind clinging to the numbers like a lifeline, the only solid thing in a world that had just collapsed into nightmare. And when I reached 1, I didn't stop. I started again from 100, my eyes still squeezed shut, afraid of what I would see if I opened them. I did this 3 more times, losing track of the numbers, just repeating the sequence until the raw edge of the panic began to dull into a numb, hollow ache. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I dared to open my eyes. The lobby was silent. The rain had stopped outside. The only sound was the low hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. I looked at the security monitor. The screen was completely black. Not the black of a powered-off screen, but a deep, uniform blackness, the same absolute void as the shadow in the hall. I reached out a trembling hand and pressed the power button. Nothing happened. I unplugged the monitor from the wall, waited a few seconds, and plugged it back in. The screen remained a perfect, unbroken sheet of darkness. I left it that way. I sat there for the rest of the night, not moving, not reading, not thinking. I just stared at the dark wood of the front desk, waiting for the sun to come up. When the first gray light of dawn filtered through the windows, I finally moved my stiff limbs. I took the list of rules from under my keyboard. I didn't read it again. I simply folded it neatly and put it in my pocket. I needed to take it with me. I couldn't leave it for someone else to find and dismiss. When Bill came in, smelling of coffee and the outside world, I told him the guest in 303 had checked out early. My voice was flat, devoid of emotion. I didn't mention the phone call. I didn't mention the shadow or the scream or the broken monitor. Bill just grunted, not even looking up from his paperwork, and said, "Fine." He didn't ask for a key. He didn't ask for any details. That was the moment I understood that he knew. He knew exactly what happened in this hotel at night. He had given me that list not as a warning, but as a waiver. I was just the night watchman, a sacrificial lamb to the hotel's dark appetite. I didn't say another word. I just walked out from behind the desk, left the key next to the dead monitor, and pushed through the heavy front doors. The morning sun hit me, and I actually staggered, the warmth on my skin feeling like a miracle, like a pardon from a death sentence. I never went back. I got in my car and drove, and I didn't stop until I was 50 miles away. I found a new job, a normal one in a brightly lit office with people who talked about sports and television shows, people whose biggest worry was a looming deadline, not a shadow that pointed. I sometimes drive past the Starline Hotel on my way to see family. The sign still flickers, a weak, arrhythmic pulse against the vast Texas sky. I wonder about the new night auditor, if they got the same list of rules, if they're following them with the blind faith I eventually learned. I wonder if they've seen the man in the gray suit, or heard the big band music that ends with a single lonely trumpet note. And I hope, for their sake, that they're not as curious or as foolishly compassionate as I was, that when the clock hits 2:04 a.m. and the phone stays silent, they know enough to just look away and count and count and count.